The fluorescent lights of Mercy General hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass, and Dr. Sterling watched Natalie Hayes move through the ER with the kind of efficiency that bothered him. Not the good kind of bothered, the kind that made predators tilt their heads when they sensed something was off about the prey. He didn't know yet. That was the only thing keeping the night shift intact. She stocked the supply cart with mechanical precision, her scrubs a pale blue that concealed everything beneath, the scar tissue mapping her left shoulder like a road map of places civilians never went, the muscle memory of hands that had sutured wounds in conditions far worse than this sterile, humming hallway. The unit patch in her locker was faded olive drab, barely recognizable now, with blood stains that had never quite washed out no matter how many times she'd tried. It was sewn inside the lining of an old jacket she didn't wear anymore, hidden the way she hid everything else. At 2 in the morning, a trauma alert came through the intercom. Chest injury, blunt force, ETA 4 minutes. The ER transformed instantly, the way it always did, nurses pivoting, physicians appearing like they'd been summoned, the controlled chaos of a system built for this exact moment. Natalie moved without hurrying, each motion economical. No wasted energy. No drama. Dr. Sterling was on duty that night. He arrived at Trauma Bay 3 with his signature confidence, the kind that came from having never truly lost. 47 years old, silver-threaded hair combed with precision, a Rolex that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was the kind of man who walked into rooms and waited for acknowledgement. Today, acknowledgement came in the form of a 28-year-old male with a pneumothorax and dropping oxygen saturation. Chest tube setup, Sterling ordered, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed immediately. Natalie was already moving. She gathered the equipment, the thoracostomy tray, the 36 French chest tube, the underwater seal drainage system, her hand steady as a surgical laser. Sterling began prepping the patient's chest wall, explaining his procedure in the tone of someone performing for an audience. We're looking at a tension pneumothorax here. Classic presentation. I'll establish entry at the 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line. Standard approach. Standard. The word hung in the air like a challenge. When his hands moved to make the incision, they hesitated. Just slightly. A tremor that could have been fatigue or could have been something else. Natalie saw it the way a pianist hears a missed note in an orchestra, a single wrong note that shifts everything. She stepped forward. Her hands took the scalpel from his. She didn't ask permission. She made the incision with a kind of speed that comes from having done it 1,000 times, in conditions where hesitation meant death. The angle was sharper than Sterling's would have been, more efficient. She placed the tube with a precision that made the patient's oxygen saturation climb immediately, from 68 to 72 to 78 to 84. Each number a small victory. The fluorescent light above them flickered once, steadied. Sterling's face had gone very still. Not angry. Not yet. Something colder than anger. Assessment. The look a hunter gets when he realizes the rabbit has claws. Who trained you? He asked quietly. The other nurses pretended not to hear. They always did. Natalie secured the tube, checked the breath sounds, didn't look at him. Nursing school. Same as everyone else. But she'd said it too quickly. The lie had sharp edges. Sterling watched her for a moment longer, his eyes moving across her hands as if they were a puzzle he needed to solve. Then he smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd decided something. I'll want to review your credentials. Your background. For my records. Quality assurance purposes. Of course, doctor, she said, still not meeting his eyes. Deferential. Small. The way she'd learned to be when being invisible was survival. The patient stabilized over the next hour. By 3 a.m., he was stable enough for the ICU, and Sterling had already left the ER, disappearing into the administrative offices like a man who needed to make phone calls. Natalie stayed, charting her notes with the precision of someone who knew that every word might be read by eyes that wanted to find a reason to question her competence. The night shift wore on. By 4:45 a.m., the ER had quieted into that strange liminal space where the city was too tired to have accidents but too restless to sleep. Natalie was restocking the rapid sequence intubation cart, the endotracheal tubes, the laryngoscopes, the medications that meant the difference between breathing and drowning. Her hands moved through the motions with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from having done it in the dark, in the dust, in places where the sound of helicopters meant either rescue or death. "Your hands." She didn't turn around. The voice came from behind her, from the doorway of the supply room. Mitchell. Former combat medic, now a transfer from the orthopedic unit, only 4 days into his rotation at Mercy General. He was tall, with a kind of posture that came from years of bearing weight, and his eyes had the clarity of someone who'd seen too much to be fooled by pretense. "I'm sorry." She kept her voice level. Kept moving. The laryngoscope went into its slot. The 4.0 endotracheal tube next to it. "Helm and Province," he said quietly. "I'd recognize those hands anywhere." The room went very still. Not the silence of an empty ER at 4:45 a.m. The silence of a defibrillator's pause before the shock. The silence of a held breath. She turned slowly. Looked at him directly for the first time in 4 days. His eyes were brown, steady, without judgment. He was looking at her hands, not her face. Looking at the scars that mapped her knuckles, the way the tendons of her wrist moved with the kind of precision that came from suturing veins under mortar fire, that came from holding together people who shouldn't have survived but did because her hands refused to stop moving. 2008, he said. It wasn't a question. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. You were attached to our Charlie Company for 6 weeks. After the ambush in Sanjan Valley. Natalie's jaw tightened. Just barely. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Everything she'd buried, sealed away in the part of her mind where the rain fell on places that didn't exist anymore, where the names of dead men were written in a language that was classified, it was pushing against the walls now. Trying to break through. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. But her voice had changed. Just slightly. Deeper. More certain. Less deferential. The voice of someone who'd given orders instead of taking them. "Senior Chief," Mitchell said, and the rank hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Like a wall between who she was and who she'd had to become. "You stopped the bleeding on Martinez." "On Thompson." Thompson got out of Walter Reed and married his high school sweetheart. He has 2 kids now. You held him together long enough for the medevac. She turned back to the intubation cart. Her hands were steady as she checked the 7.0 tube, verified the 10 cubic centimeter syringe was attached to the pilot balloon. Everything in its place. Everything controlled. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly. "That person doesn't exist anymore." "Yeah," Mitchell said. He understood. She could hear it in his voice, the recognition of someone who'd also tried to disappear, to become someone smaller and safer. She was ordered to disappear, wasn't she? Natalie didn't answer. Couldn't. The classified extraction that had gone sideways, the Navy's quiet decision that Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes had died in Helm and Province 5 years ago, that surfacing meant compromising operations, meant endangering the people she'd kept alive. All of it was locked away in a vault with a combination only she and 3 flag officers knew. "The night shift supervisor position opens next month," Mitchell said after a moment. He was still in the doorway, not advancing, not threatening. Just stating facts. "You could apply. Stop hiding." She turned back to face him. And for just a second, the briefest second, let him see what was underneath. The person who'd kept bleeding soldiers breathing through firefights that lasted hours. The person who'd been ordered to die. The person who was still trying to figure out how to live. "Some people are meant to stay buried," she said. Mitchell nodded slowly. Then he turned and left, his boots quiet against the linoleum tile, leaving Natalie alone with the supply cart and the fluorescent lights and the weight of a name that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. In the distance, a siren wailed, another accident, another reason for the ER to come alive again. She finished restocking the cart. Her hands moved with perfect precision, the way they always did. And she didn't think about the rain that would fall on Helmand Province tonight, or the men whose names she wasn't allowed to remember anymore, or the fact that Mitchell had recognized her when the rest of the hospital saw only a quiet night shift nurse who kept her head down and never asked for anything. By 5:44 a.m., Dr. Sterling still hadn't returned to the ER. But she knew he would. And she knew, with the certainty of someone trained to assess threats, that he'd bring questions with him when he did. The red marker hit the unit board at 6:41 a.m., bold slashing letters that seemed to bleed across the white surface like a wound. Dr. Sterling stood before the gathered shift, 20 nurses, 3 residents, 2 physician assistants, and read the words aloud, his voice carrying the satisfied lilt of a man who'd just drawn first blood. Natalie Hayes. Unauthorized protocol deviation during Code Blue. Formal reprimand. He turned from the board, scanning the room until his eyes found her. She stood near the back, updating her patient assignment sheet, her hand steady as surgical steel. Our little cowgirl here thinks she knows better than attending physicians. The silence was immediate and absolute. Fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone overhead. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Sarah from oncology looked away first, suddenly very interested in the coffee machine. Natalie didn't look up from her clipboard. Her jaw clenched, just once, a brief tightening of muscle beneath the skin, but when she finally raised her eyes, they were flat as slate. She turned back to her assignment and continued writing as if he'd been speaking to empty air. That should have ended it. In Dr. Sterling's experience, humiliation worked best when it broke people. When they trembled. When they cried in supply closets or called in sick the next day. Natalie did neither. She clocked in like she always did, moved through her first 3 patient rooms with the same efficient precision, checked every monitor, every medication, every vital sign. By 9 a.m., she'd already caught a medication error by another nurse, a 500 mg dose instead of 50 mg, and flagged it quietly to the pharmacy without fanfare. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd done it right in front of him. Sterling's jaw tightened as he watched her work through the morning. She was making him look bad by being competent. That wouldn't do. That wouldn't do at all. By afternoon, he'd engineered his next move with the precision of a chess player who'd memorized every possible opening. Captain Hendricks had been admitted that morning with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, prognosis grim, and his family, 3 adult children, a wife of 42 years, a sister who'd flown in from Charlotte, had gathered in room 347 like people waiting for a verdict they already knew. Sterling entered the room at 2:15 p.m., Natalie following behind with fresh for fluids and the patient's afternoon medications. The family looked up with the hollow eyes of the dying adjacent, that particular exhaustion that comes from sitting at a bedside watching someone slip away one breath at a time. Nurse Hayes, Sterling said, his voice pitched for maximum audience reach, can you explain to these good people why you administered medication without my direct order during the Code Blue yesterday? Natalie set the 4 bag on the pole with deliberate care. The plastic crinkled softly. You ordered 2 milligrams pushes of midazolam, doctor. I administered exactly as ordered. The timing, however, Sterling's smile was shark teeth bright. You didn't wait for my explicit instruction before each dose. Is following basic medical hierarchy beyond your nursing school education? Captain Hendricks' daughter flinched at the tone. His wife stared at Sterling like she was trying to understand what kind of person chooses a moment like this to establish dominance. The sister's hands curled into fists in her lap. Natalie took one measured breath. The kind of breath a person takes when they're counting down from something. When they're restraining themselves with conscious effort. Her eyes never left Sterling's face, didn't look away, didn't drop, didn't show a flicker of the rage that must have been burning behind her sternum like a pilot light. Then a single tear escaped from the corner of her left eye. Just one. She reached up and wiped it away without breaking eye contact, the gesture so economical, so controlled, that it felt less like emotion and more like a tactical decision. When she spoke, her voice sounded like cut glass. Like something forged in heat and sharpened on stone. Like a woman who'd been training for this moment her entire life. I've held together better men than you with fewer tools than this hospital has in storage, Doctor. The room went dead silent. Captain Hendrick's eyes widened slightly. His wife made a small sound, not quite approval, but something close. Sterling's face flushed from his collar upward, his jaw working soundlessly for 2 full seconds before he turned and left the room without another word. Natalie finished checking before without trembling. Without hesitation. Without anything in her bearing that suggested she'd just detonated something that couldn't be put back together. She adjusted the flow rate, documented the medications, and excused herself with the courtesy of a funeral director. Only when she was in the hallway did her hands press briefly against the cool tile wall, just for a moment, just long enough to let the trembling happen where nobody could see it. The break room exile began that evening. She made her coffee at 6:45 p.m. during the evening shift transition, black, no sugar, the same way she'd made it every day for 3 years. The break room was crowded, Sarah from oncology reviewing her chart, 2 nurses from the day shift lingering to finish their conversations, Mitchell from the transfer unit reading something on his phone. Natalie sat down at the small table near the window, the one with a view of the parking lot where rain had started to fall, tapping against the glass like Morse code. Within 90 seconds, Sarah stood abruptly. I need to check on my patient. She didn't have a patient in critical condition. There was no particular urgency in her voice. She just left. One of the day shift nurses gathered her things. Then the other followed. Mitchell stayed for exactly 30 seconds longer, long enough to study Natalie's profile like he was trying to place a ghost, like he was matching her face to a memory from 5 years ago, from another country, from another lifetime. Then he too excused himself, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes full of questions he didn't ask. Natalie sat alone with her coffee, watching the rain streak the window. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply existed in the silence, drinking her coffee and accepting the exile like it was just another protocol to follow. By Friday, this became routine. The break room door would open, she would enter, and within moments it would empty again as if she carried a contagion. Sarah wouldn't meet her eyes anymore, just gathered her things and disappeared. The nurses from pediatrics who used to chat with her about their weekends now timed their breaks to avoid overlapping with hers. Even the residents, usually desperate for any social interaction, suddenly remembered urgent consults elsewhere. Sterling, meanwhile, had found his rhythm. He called her cowgirl during rounds, his voice dripping contempt. Cowgirl, remind me again which protocol says you get to make your own judgment calls. He questioned every medication administration, every clinical decision, every moment she showed independent thought. In front of the surgical team. In front of patients' families. In front of anyone who could bear witness to his authority being restored. She pushed through each shift like a person moving through water, every action documented, every order triple-checked, every decision defensible to the point of paralysis. She was buying time. She was staying invisible. She was following rules written by people who'd told her that surfacing meant endangering everyone she'd saved, everyone from Helm and Province, everyone from that classified extraction that had gone sideways 5 years ago, everyone whose life she'd held together with hands that now trembled in her apartment at 3 in the morning when nobody was watching. Mitchell watched all of it from his unit upstairs, fitting pieces together like a puzzle he'd been working on since the moment he'd recognized those hands performing emergency field medicine with the muscle memory of someone trained to save lives in the worst possible circumstances. He said nothing. Not yet. But his eyes tracked her movements through the hospital with the careful attention of someone who'd already made a decision about what truth meant and how far he'd go to protect it. And in his office on the administrative floor, Dr. Sterling reviewed the patient files again, studying the billing records, feeling the walls closing in with every notation Natalie made. Every single one documented perfectly. Every medication listed. Every procedure recorded with the meticulous precision of someone who understood that attention to detail was survival. He'd miscalculated. He'd thought breaking her would be simple. He'd thought fear would make her careless. Instead, she'd become obsessively careful, and that careful attention was like a spotlight slowly rotating toward the phantom surgical consults he'd been running for 5 years. Toward the $847,000 in referral kickbacks. Toward the fraud that had become his entire financial existence. He picked up his phone and started dialing. The phone line connected before the second ring. Board Chairman Davis answered like a man accustomed to being important, his voice pitched somewhere between authority and irritation. Dr. Sterling didn't bother with preamble. Chairman Davis. We have a situation at Mercy General that requires your immediate attention. The lie came smooth as surgical silk. One of our nursing staff just performed an invasive procedure without attending oversight. Tension pneumothorax decompression. Textbook insubordination. Sterling let the word settle, knowing Davis had referred 17 orthopedic cases to him over the past 3 years, cases that had generated exactly $312,000 in referral kickbacks. The kind of debt that made men listen. The issue is broader than today's incident. This nurse exhibits a pattern of erratic judgment. Unstable. Potentially dangerous. Sterling could hear Davis shifting, the sound of a man remembering who he owed. I wanted you to hear it from me, not through official channels. Professional courtesy. The pause lasted exactly 4 seconds. I appreciate you calling, Sterling. What do you need? That was the voice of compliance. Within 20 minutes, Sterling had the chairman's assurance that an external investigator would be on site by morning. Within 40 minutes, he'd made 5 more calls to names in Natalie's nursing school records, each one carefully selected, each conversation beginning the same way. I'm calling about a former classmate of yours. Natalie Hayes. The pause that followed was always the same. Sterling's voice would drop, becoming confidential, the tone of a concerned colleague. We're conducting some routine clinical reviews, and her name came up. I was hoping you could speak to her stability during school. Any incidents? Any patterns of behavior that gave you concern? He never waited for a real answer, just let the implication hang there like humidity before a storm. By the time he disconnected, the damage was already seeded. A former instructor remembered her being intense, maybe too intense. A clinical supervisor from her rotation recalled her challenging authority during a medication protocol review. Nothing concrete. Nothing actionable. Everything suggestive. That was the genius of it. The external investigator arrived at Mercy General on Tuesday morning wearing a charcoal suit and carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive enough to have been purchased specifically to intimidate. His name was Harold Vance, and he worked for a firm that specialized in clinical audits for hospitals worried about liability. Sterling had met him in the parking lot before business hours even started, handing him a carefully prepared list of 23 patient cases with handwritten notes beside each one. These are the ones I'm concerned about, Sterling said, the picture of professional caution. Nothing overt. Just procedural inconsistencies. Unorthodox technique selections that, while they happen to result in positive outcomes, don't align with our institutional standards. Vance flipped through the pages with the methodical precision of someone used to building cases. You're saying she operates outside protocol regularly? Sterling nodded slowly. I'm saying she has a pattern of prioritizing results over procedure. In a hospital, that's how liability snowballs. What Sterling didn't say was that every single case on that list was a save, patients who would have died under textbook protocol but lived because Natalie Hayes operated like someone trained to keep breathing the barely alive in the worst possible conditions. Over the next 72 hours, Vance conducted his audit with the focused intensity of a prosecutor building an indictment. He pulled patient charts. He watched video footage of Natalie working in trauma bays. He interviewed nursing staff, the one Sterling had quietly suggested might have concerns. With each case, Vance grew more certain he was building something damaging. The pediatric airway she'd secured using a technique that wasn't in the hospital's approved protocol manual. The septic patient she'd treated with vasopressors before official sepsis protocol authorization. The cardiac arrest she'd managed with medication sequences that deviated from ACLS standard. On paper, removed from context, removed from outcomes, removed from the fact that every single one of those decisions had kept someone breathing who had no right to be breathing, it looked like recklessness. Sterling sat in Vance's makeshift office on Thursday afternoon and watched the investigator construct his case like a man laying bricks. "This nurse operates as if she's answerable to no one," Vance said, tapping a pen against his portfolio. That kind of independence in a hospital environment is exactly how malpractice happens. Sterling almost smiled. "I'm glad you see it clearly." The investigator looked up. "My report will recommend immediate suspension pending formal review. At minimum." That night, Natalie stood in the rain at Riverside Cemetery in Raleigh, water hammering the ground like applause for the dead. Marcus's headstone was grey granite, simple enough that it could have belonged to anyone. 5 years and 3 months since the Navy had called her at 2 a.m. and told her that Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes was officially dead, that she needed to disappear, that surfacing would endanger every person she'd ever saved. She'd done what they asked. She'd taken her late husband's maiden name, Hayes had been his mother's family name, and buried her medals and her rank and her call sign somewhere in the classified records of a SCAF she'd never visit again. She'd become a nurse. A regular nurse. Someone who healed people. Someone who could finally keep the promise she'd made to Marcus on his last leave, holding his hand in their tiny apartment on Fort Bragg. "When I get out, I'm going to spend my whole life putting people back together instead of tearing them apart." She'd gotten out. She'd gotten a nursing degree. She'd moved to North Carolina and found Mercy General and walked onto the ER floor like a ghost trying to learn how to be human again. The rain soaked through her scrubs. She didn't move. "I promised you I'd keep healing people, and I couldn't even do that right." Her voice sounded fractured against the rain, fractured and small. "I failed, Marcus. I got fired for saving someone's life. For using the only thing I've ever been good at." She pressed her palm against the wet granite, and for a moment, just a moment, she let herself feel the weight of 5 years of burial, 5 years of being nobody, 5 years of watching people die in ER bays because hospital protocol was written for people who'd never seen what she'd seen, who'd never had to choose between textbook medicine and keeping someone's heart beating through blood loss in the Helmand dust. "I don't know how to be small anymore. And I can't be what I was." The rain intensified. Thunder rolled across the Raleigh skyline like distant artillery, and for one suspended second, Natalie let herself be both things at once, the nurse who healed, and the officer who'd held men together with equipment and will and hand steady from years of operating in the space between life and death. She drove to a pharmacy on Edwards Mill Road afterward, because she needed work and she'd learned a long time ago that running toward something was better than running away. The position was part-time, third shift, restocking shelves and managing inventory. Minimum wage. Nobody important. Nobody visible. She'd been there for 3 hours, organizing surgical supplies with the same methodical precision she'd once used to arrange tactical equipment, when her phone vibrated in her locker. A text from the hospital. "Immediate suspension effective immediately pending external review. Security will collect your belongings. Do not return to premises." She read it twice. The second time, she didn't feel anything at all. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close. Because somewhere in a converted interrogation suite in McLean, Virginia, a Pentagon server had automatically flagged her name the moment the hospital's termination paperwork hit the federal medical credentialing system. Not because they were watching her, they weren't supposed to be. The classified extraction in Helmand 5 years ago had been officially buried. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes was officially dead. But someone in JSOC Task Force 121 still monitored the databases. Someone still kept track of ghosts. And when a ghost disappeared from a civilian hospital under accusations of insubordination, that someone picked up a secure phone and made a call to a man named Captain James Rivera, who'd spent 5 years of his life searching parking lots and hospital databases and veteran support groups for the Navy corpsman whose hands had kept him breathing through a firefight that should have killed him. The same corpsman whose face he'd seen for exactly 37 seconds in an ambulance bay before she'd performed needle decompression like she'd done it 1,000 times before, which she had, just not in an American hospital with fluorescent lights and a chain of command she no longer answered to. The ambulance bay doors burst open at 2:47 a.m., and the world compressed into 40 seconds. The stretcher came fast, paramedics calling vitals in the practiced shorthand of people who'd seen too much. Male, age 38, GSW to left thorax, tension pneumo, O2 sat 72 and dropping. The patient's chest heaved against itself, each breath a losing battle against collapsed lung tissue that couldn't exchange oxygen anymore. His eyes were wide. Panicked. Drowning on dry land. Dr. Sterling stood at the observation window of the ambulance bay, arms crossed, watching with the detached interest of someone attending a departmental meeting. The attending physician, Dr. Reeves, was 2 minutes out, still in his car, still 3 minutes away from this crisis that wouldn't wait 3 minutes. The patient's oxygen was collapsing faster than anyone could explain later. 72. 68. 62. Natalie moved. Not rushed. Not frantic. The kind of motion that came from muscle memory that had performed this exact procedure in conditions far worse than fluorescent-lit tile and a functional trauma bay. Her hands were already moving for the 14-gauge angiocath needle before her brain had finished the calculation, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical landmark that meant the difference between this man living to see morning and becoming another autopsy report filed away in Sterling's hospital statistics. "I need consent from," someone started. "Patients in arrest." Her voice was flat. "Clinical. Consent is assumed." The needle went in. The hiss of pressurized air escaping, that specific sound that meant lung tissue had been collapsing for longer than anyone wanted to acknowledge. O2 climbing. 75. 82. 90. The patient's breathing synchronized with the ventilator in 7 seconds. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. Stable vitals. The stretcher moving toward Trauma Bay 3 with Natalie moving alongside it like she was wired directly into the transport, reading every number, adjusting every line, her hand steady as surgical lasers. Sterling's jaw tightened at the window. He watched her move. Watched her command the room without raising her voice. Watched a nurse perform needle decompression for tension pneumothorax with the precise, economical movement of someone who'd done it in actual combat conditions, not simulated ones in hospital training sessions. He watched the attending arrive 30 seconds later to find the crisis already resolved, the patient already stable, Natalie already stepping back from the stretcher with the expression of someone who'd just finished her morning coffee. That was when Sterling's phone started buzzing. Not one call. Multiple. His network was already awake, board members checking email at 3 in the morning, reading the carefully worded message he'd sent at 2:59 a.m., exactly 40 seconds after watching Natalie Hayes perform an authorized emergency medicine. The email was surgical in its precision. No accusations. Just implications. Concerning pattern of autonomous decision-making in critical situations, liability exposure when nursing staff exceed scope of practice, potential risk management implications for board consideration, recommend immediate review of recent procedural irregularities. He'd CC'd the hospital attorney. He'd copied the board chairman. He'd activated every favor owed to him in a single keystroke. By 6 a.m., the external investigator's report had materialized like conjured smoke. 47 pages of documentation highlighting every decision Natalie had made in the past 18 months. The patient she'd stabilized outside protocol. The procedures she'd assisted with that fell into gray areas of hospital policy. The way she moved in a trauma bay like she'd been trained somewhere other than nursing school. The report concluded with a single, devastating phrase, pattern suggests practice beyond licensure scope with potential disregard for established chain of command. Sterling forwarded it to HR with a personal note. "I wanted to flag this for your attention before it becomes a liability issue." By 11 a.m., Natalie was sitting in HR Director Stephanie Chen's office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead with that particular hum of institutional fluorescence that made everything feel smaller, colder. Stephanie's face was apologetic in the way that meant her hands were tied. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately for gross insubordination and practicing beyond scope of licensure." Behind Natalie, Sterling leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, not saying a word. He didn't need to. The paperwork said everything. The external investigator's report was clipped to the termination letter. The board chairman's signature was already on the recommendation. Security arrived with a cardboard box, the kind that restaurants used for takeout, now repurposed for the personal effects of a nurse who'd just been erased from Mercy General's payroll. Natalie packed with mechanical precision. Her badge clattered against the tile floor as she removed it, the sound echoing down the corridor like a bell toll. Her stethoscope. Her reference materials. The small framed photo of Marcus in his dress uniform, the one she kept in her locker. The walk through the ER was the worst part. Not because anyone stopped her. Because no one did. Sarah from oncology looked away. Mitchell stood at the top of the stairwell, jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle working, but he didn't move. The staff she'd trained, the colleagues she'd covered for on night shifts, the nurses who'd watched her save a man's life 12 hours ago, they all looked away like she'd already become a ghost. The rain was biblical that evening. Not rain. Apocalypse. Lightning split the sky as Natalie stood at her husband's grave in Oakwood Cemetery, water streaming down her face mixing with tears, the cardboard box at her feet because she had nowhere else to put it. Marcus's headstone was simple, Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, Navy SEAL, KIA 2018, and she pressed her palm against the granite like it could somehow transmit through stone to wherever he'd gone. "I promised you I'd keep healing people." Her voice was barely audible over the rain. "I couldn't even do that right. I failed, Marcus." Thunder rolled across the cemetery like distant artillery. "You always said healing was my calling. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was never supposed to be here." The cemetery was empty except for ghosts and rain and a woman who'd held together better men than Dr. Sterling with fewer tools than the hospital had in storage, now standing in a downpour at the grave of the man she'd loved, thinking about a patient whose life she'd saved and a career that had evaporated in the time it took to process paperwork. She drove across town before dawn, to a pharmacy in a strip mall off Falls of News Road, and accepted a night shift stocking job for $12 an hour. No medical experience required. No background check that might catch the classified gaps in her record. Just shelves and inventory and a manager who didn't ask questions. She didn't tell anyone where she'd gone. Not Mitchell. Not the colleagues who'd watched her be escorted out. Not anyone. She simply disappeared, not by order this time, but by necessity. 3 days passed in that pharmacy, her hands placing boxes of antacids and cold medicine on shelves that stretched out like infinity, her mind somewhere else entirely. 3 days of existing in the margins, of being just another pharmacy worker, of being nobody at all. Then the sound started as a rumble that registered in her chest before her ears could process it, rotor wash that made the pharmacy windows vibrate, that made customers look up from their shopping with the confused expressions of people hearing something that didn't belong in a civilian retail space. She was in aisle 7, placing boxes of diabetic supplies on the shelf, when she heard it. 2 Black Hawk helicopters, their rotors cutting the air like they were slicing through something solid. The sirens in the city answered. Police traffic. Radio chatter. And then, somehow, through the pharmacy's small television mounted above the pharmacy counter, footage of Mercy General's parking lot with military helicopters touching down, with uniformed personnel moving with purpose, with the kind of official machinery that only moved when something classified had just surfaced in a civilian hospital. She didn't need to see more. Something had changed. Something had shifted the impossible back into the realm of consequence. The rotor wash hit the glass like artillery. 2 UH-60M Blackhawks descended through the Raleigh afternoon, their shadows swallowing the Mercy General parking lot whole. Nurses looked up from their phones. A resident froze mid-stride. The helicopters didn't land in a designated pad. They landed in the circle drive, rotors still turning, a statement written in diesel exhaust and military precision. A SEAL team commander emerged from the first bird. Not the kind of officer who asked permission. The kind who carried classified authority the way other men carried briefcases. He walked through the lobby with the fluid precision of apex predators, boots striking tile with rhythm that sounded like a countdown. His uniform was desert tan. His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic. He did not stop at reception. He did not introduce himself. He walked directly into Administrator Henderson's office and closed the door with a click that echoed through 3 floors. "I need the location of Senior Chief Hayes, call sign Nightingale. And I needed it 5 minutes ago." The administrator's face drained. He had no idea who that was. He said so. The commander's jaw tightened. "Check your John Doe from the ambulance bay. Tension pneumothorax, needle decompression in the field, 7 days ago." "Who performed that procedure?" Henderson's hands trembled as he pulled the file. The staff nurse had documented it. One name. Natalie. No last name recorded in the early notes, but there, the intake form. Hayes. The needle decompression had saved this man's life in 40 seconds. 40 seconds. Where is she? She was terminated last week. Security escorted her out. The SEAL commander's expression didn't change. That was worse. When anger stops showing, it means the person is thinking about solutions, not emotions. Find her. Now. Henderson made calls. Natalie's employment file had a forwarding address, not a home. A pharmacy on Fayetteville Street. She'd applied 3 days after termination. Minimum wage. Night shift. The irony made everyone in that office feel physically sick. The SEAL commander was already moving. 30 minutes later, Natalie was stocking the vitamin aisle in a blue pharmacy vest when a Navy officer walked through the sliding doors. Not uniformed. Civilian clothes. But the military moves were unmistakable, the way he held space around himself, the way people instinctively stepped aside. He approached with the confidence of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions. Senior Chief Hayes. She turned. Her hands were steady. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply turned, and in that turning, something shifted in the air pressure itself. "I was ordered to stay dead." "I know." Captain James Rivera made one phone call to Admiral Garrett. That call activated every protocol we had. Your 5-year detail ended the moment you saved his life. You broke cover for the right reason. The Navy doesn't forget that. Natalie set down the vitamin bottle she'd been holding. The gesture was careful. Deliberate. Like someone setting down a weapon. Captain Rivera. Woke up 3 days ago. Saw your face. Recognized the hands before he recognized the features. He's been carrying that unit patch sewn in his jacket lining for 5 years, waiting for the day he'd find you. The commander's voice dropped. It sounded like a tank idling in a garage, dangerous, patient, inevitable. You kept him breathing through a firefight in Sanjin Valley. He never forgot. Neither did the Navy. The commander handed her an envelope. Sealed. Official. Her name typed across the front in military formatting. Orders. Full reinstatement, back pay for the 7 days, formal hospital apology, and a position that's waiting for you if you want it. Director of Emergency Medicine. You'll reform that place. Natalie's hands didn't shake. But something in her eyes changed. Like someone opening a door to a room they'd been ordered to keep locked for 5 years. Your daughter wants to meet you, the commander continued. Captain Rivera's daughter. Sophia. She's 8 years old. She's been waiting in your hospital lobby for the past 4 hours with her father, telling every single board member that her daddy says you're a senior chief petty officer. The commander's phone rang. He answered. Listened. His expression hardened into something that looked like satisfaction. Copy that. How long until arraignment? A pause. Understood. Let us know when he's booked. He ended the call and looked directly at Natalie. Dr. Sterling attempted to forge your military records. The FBI just finished the warrant execution. They found his server documented everything, 5 years of phantom surgical consults, billing for procedures never performed. He was moving $847,000 a year through those phantom codes. Your attention to documentation would have eventually flagged the discrepancies. He couldn't let that happen. Natalie set down her pharmacy vest. Carefully. Like she was removing a costume that no longer fit. 2 hours later, in the marble lobby of Mercy General, everyone who had looked away was forced to look again. The SEAL commander stood beneath the skylight with Natalie's file unsealed in his hands, reading her decorations aloud to a room that had suddenly become very, very small. The hospital's lead nurse, Patricia Chen, who'd supervised Natalie's training, was reading the classified portions with trembling hands. Combat surgeon instructor. 12 years of field medicine across 3 continents. 2 Bronze Stars. A Purple Heart. The Navy Cross. The decorations came one at a time, each one its own beat, each one another layer of truth about the woman they'd shunned. Bronze Star, the commander said. Patricia Chen made a sound like a prayer. Silver Star. Board member Davis stopped breathing. 2 Purple Hearts. And a Navy Cross for actions under fire that remain classified. The room didn't just go silent. The silence became a physical thing, the kind of silence that happens when a group of people realizes simultaneously that they've been catastrophically wrong. Mitchell stood in the back corner with his arms crossed, watching everything with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd known the truth all along. Sarah from oncology had both hands over her mouth. The external investigator who'd been paid to fabricate grounds against Natalie was staring at the floor like he was hoping it would open. The administrator excused himself and didn't come back. 3 FBI agents walked through those doors at exactly 2:27 p.m. They'd arrested Dr. Sterling at his residence 40 minutes earlier. They walked him through the same lobby where he'd humiliated Natalie, walked him past the same nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room, walked him toward the doors with his hands cuffed behind his back. The perp walk was precise. Professional. Devastating. The charge was healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of federal documents. The investigation had revealed over $2 million in kickback payments over 5 years, money laundered through phantom surgical consults that had never existed. You have the right to remain silent, the agent recited, and the words sounded like a funeral march. Mitchell finally spoke when Sterling was halfway to the elevator. His voice carried through the marble lobby like a command. I knew her hands the first day. Helmand Province, different unit, different tour. I watched you people treat a decorated senior chief petty officer like trash, and I want every single one of you to remember which of you looked away. He paused. His eyes moved across the room, cataloguing faces, recording cowardice. I'll remember. Captain James Rivera was wheeled down from ICU 40 minutes later. He wasn't stable enough for long-distance travel, but he was stable enough to move. His daughter Sophia walked beside his wheelchair, holding his hand. When they reached the lobby, when he saw the administrator, when he saw the board, his face was composed but his daughter's wasn't. She marched directly to the hospital board like an 8-year-old waging war. My daddy says she's a senior chief petty officer, Sophia said, her voice steady as a soldier's. And my daddy says she saved his life, and you fired her anyway. That's bad. That's really bad. The administrator couldn't meet her eyes. Rivera's voice was soft when he finally spoke, but soft and dangerous were the same thing. I'll thank Senior Chief Hayes myself. In person. But before I do, I want this board to understand something. That woman saved my life in Helmand Province. And she saved it again in that ambulance bay. 2 rescues. 2 debts I'll never repay. He turned to face them directly. You made a choice to believe a liar over a hero. Now you get to live with that choice. They found Natalie 3 hours later, back at the pharmacy, stocking shelves like nothing had changed. The SEAL commander delivered the news himself. Reinstatement. Full back pay. A formal written apology from the hospital board. And an offer. Director of Emergency Medicine. A position that would give her institutional authority to make sure what happened to her never happened to another nurse with hidden credentials, hidden strength, hidden sacrifice. Natalie listened to the offer with her hand steady, her jaw level, her eyes fixed on the vitamin bottles in front of her. The commander waited. He understood that some people didn't cry when they received redemption. Some people just stood very still and let the weight of 5 years finally settle into the ground where it belonged. Yes, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A commitment. A return. I'll take the position. Outstanding, Senior Chief. Welcome home. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Sterling teaching CPR at a community college for minimum wage. His medical license had been permanently revoked. The fraud trial was still pending. His name had become a cautionary tale, the kind of story administrators told new hires about what happened when you treated power as permission. At Mercy General, the marble lobby smelled like antiseptic and rain. Director of Emergency Medicine Natalie Hayes stood in dress blues at a ceremony honoring combat veterans in healthcare. Her uniform was crisp. Her medals were visible. The Navy Cross caught the light like a promise kept. Captain James Rivera stood beside her in his army dress uniform, that faded unit patch now framed on her office wall. He looked at her like she'd given him a second life, because she had. Twice. His daughter Sophia presented Natalie with a drawing, a nurse with angel wings, holding a tiny soldier in her hands. Natalie took the drawing and held it carefully, like it was the most important thing anyone had ever given her. Thank you for breathing life back into me, Senior Chief, Rivera said, and his voice sounded like the first day they'd meet in Sanjin Valley, 5 years ago, when the mission had been survival and she'd been the reason he survived. In Helmand. And again in that ambulance bay. Natalie's voice was steady. It was an honor, Captain. A Navy color guard presented the colors. Mitchell stood in dress blues beside her now, promoted to Deputy Director of Emergency Medicine. Sarah from Oncology was coordinating the refreshments. Patricia Chen, the lead nurse who'd read her file with trembling hands, was standing in the front row with tears on her face. The young nurses in attendance were watching this woman in dress blues, the one they'd almost let disappear, and understanding for the first time what they were really looking at. Natalie spoke when the ceremony reached the closing remarks. Her voice was the voice of a senior chief, measured, authoritative, carrying the weight of everything she'd survived and everyone she'd saved. I thought I'd failed the promise I made to my husband Marcus. I promised him I'd keep healing people. When I was ordered to disappear, I thought I'd broken that promise. When I was fired, I thought I'd finally lost everything. She paused. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain outside, steady and constant. I learned that healing sometimes means standing in the fire until help arrives. And I learned that help does arrive. It just takes time. She looked directly at the young nurses in attendance, the ones who would face their own impossible choices, their own moments of decision, their own tests of whether they'd look away or look toward the truth. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Sometimes the battlefield is a hospital hallway. Sometimes courage is doing the right thing when everyone is watching you fail. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is be quiet, be steady, and be ready for the moment when 5 years of hidden strength finally gets to be visible. Her eyes moved across the room. Stand firm. Stand true. And never, ever let anyone make you invisible again. Captain Rivera saluted her. Not as a captain to a director, but as a soldier to a soldier. As a man to the woman who'd saved his life. The room rose. Every person in that lobby stood, and the sound of their standing sounded like rain on a hospital roof, like helicopters landing in impossible places, like the arrival of justice that actually arrived. Outside, rain began to fall harder. But this time, Natalie Hayes wasn't standing at a grave in defeat. She was standing in the light, finally able to be both the healer and the hero she'd always been, in a hospital that would never forget what it means to almost lose someone irreplaceable. If you've ever felt invisible in a workplace, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please like and subscribe to the Code Whisperers. We tell the stories that matter, the stories of people who refuse to stay silent. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? We read every comment, and we'd love to hear your story.